Greetings from Palmer, M-A-R-E-R. For social distance sake, I am speaking from the Commonwealth of Virginia, USA. For those who do not know me, I am a dual U.S.-Hungarian citizen, emeritus business professor from Indiana University, Bloomington for 30 years, and then from Central European University, Budapest for the next 16 years. It is a privilege for me to remember the real George Soros on the occasion of his 90th birthday. Let me get right into it. Working with him, one of the most interesting things was establishing the first Western MBA program in Central and Eastern Europe early in 1987. My colleague and friend at Indiana University, George Ranki, the university's Hungarian chair professor, a well-known historian and friend of Soros, approached me, said, I just spoke for Soros and he is planning to set up a Western MBA program in Hungary to serve students from the entire region. This is your area. Can you assist him? After checking with my business school, I invited Soros to spend a few days in Bloomington to introduce him to the details of a modern MBA program. He accepted and came during the week of October 26, 1987, in the company of Sándor Demjan, at the time the founder and president of Hungarian Credit Bank, who helped Soros with this project. Just a week before they came was Black Monday, October 19. The sudden and largely unprecedented, unexpected global stock market crash, when the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 23% in one day. In the evening of the second day, a banquet was held for our guests. Soros was the keynote speaker. I remember that part of his presentation when he humorously shared details of how just the previous week, on Black Monday, he lost several $100 million on account of the Wall Street crash. Their third day was devoted discussing the details of the new business school, the International Management Center, the IMC in Budapest, which opened in 1989 and operated until 1995, when it was integrated into Soros' Central European University that he established in 1991 and has been largely funding ever since. Let me go to the second one, which is my recruitment of George Soros for the Blue Ribbon Commission. In March 1991, I attended a major international conference in Dubrovnik, then Yugoslavia, on the future of Eastern Europe. Speakers came from all over the so-called socialist countries, as well as from many Western nations. And I was on a 2-year research leave sabbatical with extra funding from foundations. And so after the second day of this major conference, I was reflecting on what are the implications for my research project of what I heard. And it suddenly dawned on me that it's not only possible, but perhaps even likely, that the systems in Eastern Europe would collapse entirely in the not-too-distant future. So the key implication for my research, which was to focus on reform of the communist system, would be not that, but how to prepare for a possible or likely system transformation program from a modified centrally planned into a market economy and democracy. Since I discussed the works of the BRC elsewhere, all I wish to focus on how I managed to recruit George Soros for the BRC project. George was among the first candidates I called to ask to serve on the commission. He listened and then said, okay, I understand you are planning a worthwhile project, but there is a fundamental problem. If I were to agree to join the BRC, in your next breath, you will ask me to fund it. That would be an unacceptable conflict of interest. I'm rather proud of how I handled the dilemma. George, if the choice is between your brain and your pocketbook, I would opt for your brain to support the BRC's effort. All Soros said, you got it. Soros did attend the BRC's bi-monthly meetings in Washington, D.C., in Brussels, in Vienna, in Budapest. Usually arrived the day before when I was supposed to brief him. Soros didn't participate too much in the debate. He didn't have time for what it seemed to him like academic things, but he read and commented on the BRC's penultimate draft and recommendation, and hand-signed it along with all the other commissioners. Now I want to turn to my third major topic, which is Soros's investment philosophy and a case study. My international business and finance courses at the IMC and at CEO Business School always had a section on Soros's published theory of how the financial markets worked, with a case study of one of his well-publicized speculative investment. On 2 occasions when Soros came to CEU, he accepted my invitation to meet my class. After brief opening remarks, he answered questions. Now, the roots of Soros's investment philosophy can be traced to World War II, especially to 1944, when Germany occupied its Axis ally Hungary and the mass killing of the country's nearly 1 million Jews had commenced. Soros was 13, going on 14. He escaped deportation by his dad, Tivadar Soros, finding an ingenious way to openly hide him. The lesson he learned then and wrote later was, expect the unexpected. A little bit of history on George. In 1947, at age 17, he managed to obtain a Hungarian passport and a British student visa and arrived in London, where he stayed for 9 years before he came to the United States. He had menial jobs, including washing dishes at the restaurant, to make ends meet. He passed his college entrance exam in all subjects except English, so at first he could only attend a commuter school because his visa required him to be a student. He sneaked into the lectures at the prestigious London School of Economics, LSE. Finally, he passed English too, so in 1949 he was admitted as a regular LSE student, where he became a disciple of the famous philosopher of science and of political systems, Karl Popper. Soros' investment theory and practice, as well as his philanthropy, were inspired in part by Popper's ideas. Soros' views of the financial markets were stated in his 1987 book, The Alchemy of Finance, Reading the Mind of the Market. The essence of his theory of reflexivity described there is that, contrary to the conventional wisdom of economists, that markets are efficient, meaning that most prices by and large correctly reflect relevant facts and expectations, the so-called fundamentals. Actually, market participants most of the time will have a partial and distorted view of the world, and that influences prices, and therefore prices often will be inappropriate, and the financial decisions behind them will be inappropriate. Soros was seeking situations where perceptions and reality were greatly out of whack, most typically in boom and bust sequences. Processes that are initially self-reinforcing eventually become unsustainable, so they will be reversed at some point. Now, it would not be fair or complete to describe George Soros's investment philosophy and practices without referencing the contributions and insights of his longtime financial manager, Stanley Druckenmiller. Quite a few of Soros' famous speculative moves were initiated or recommended by Druckenmiller, as illustrated in the case study below. And they worked together as a team for 12 years, 1988 to 2000, with Druckenmiller managing Soros' quantum funds. Thus, no one has more credible insight into Soros as an investor and speculator than Druckenmiller. And he has been open in talking about Soros' decisions and the logic behind them. A good way to illustrate what made Soros so different from most other investors and speculators is through the case study that made him famous, Breaking the Bank of England. He shared some of it with my students when he came to speak to my MBA classes twice. An essential background for following what Soros did to make an estimated net profit of $1 billion in just a few days in September 1992 is to understand the exchange rate systems of the main West European countries between 1979 and 1999, the year the euro was introduced. In the late 1970s, the European Economic Community introduced the so-called exchange rate mechanism, ERM, to reduce exchange rate variability and to achieve a degree of stability in preparation for the eventual introduction of a single currency, the euro. A so-called parity grid of bilateral rates was calculated on the basis of the central rates expressed in European currency units, and fluctuations had to be contained within 2.5% margins on either side of the bilateral rates. During the 2 decades of the ERM system, when Germany and most of the continental European countries were in the ERM, the UK did not join. Instead, it had a floating exchange rate system that is allowed the market to determine. In October 1990, the British Prime Minister John Major took the pound into the ERM. The pound came under attack immediately as investors and speculators doubted that the UK would be able to defend its exchange rate so that its lower value would not dip below minus 2.5% of the ERM determined floor. Coming under attack meant massive short selling of the pound. The key in the situation the UK found itself after it entered the ERM were the actions and intentions of the German central bank in the Bundesbank. At the time, Germany was Europe's economic powerhouse, its central bank the richest such institution, and the Deutsche Mark the region's strongest currency. In the middle of September 1992, Helmut Schlesinger, the president of the Bundesbank, gave an interview. The news summarized it by saying that he believed that there would have to be a broad realignment of Europe's currencies. This was tantamount to calling the pound to devalue. Druckenmiller read Schlesinger's comments. He walked into Soros' office and told him it was time to move. Quantum had already accumulated a 1.5 billion bet against the pound during the past month. Well, Soros responded, if the Schlesinger quote is accurate, let's go for the jugular. This was the man's genius, said Druckenmiller later. His manager has done the analysis, understood the politics, and seen the trigger for the trade. But it was Soros who sensed that this was the moment to go nuclear. Around 2 a.m. next morning, Druckenmiller returned to the office. He wanted to be at his desk when London trading opened and the Bank of England would be forced to resume purchases of the sterling. Before he had even taken off his coat, Soros checked in by phone, urging him to redouble sales of the British currency. Druckenmiller commented later, "I have learned many things from Soros, but perhaps the most significant is that it is not whether you are right or wrong that's important, but how much money you make when you are right. The few times that Soros has ever criticized me when I was really right on the market but didn't maximize the opportunity." Soros has taught me that when you have tremendous conviction on a trade, you have to go for the jugular. It takes courage to ride a profit with huge leverage, and leverage is what Soros and Druckenmiller did on that fateful day. They borrowed from banks 150% of the value of the total assets they were managing in a quantum fund, an estimated $5 billion, since the value of Quantum's local assets was, total assets was then about $3.3 billion. Many decades later, many articles at the time headlined that Soros bet the ranch by borrowing a sum that was 150% of the value of all the assets he controlled. The implication was that Soros was taking a huge risk that he could have lost it all. One of my students asked Soros about this in class, and he explained, "Wrong headlines, wrong conclusions." Already before the pound left the ERM and devalued on the evening of September 16, 1992, Quantum already had cumulative profits of several $100 million just for that year. My practice has always been to cap potential losses on any trade so that we could remain in business under any circumstance. In fact, we didn't really risk more than just the profits we already had that year. The risk of loss was maybe 2.5 to 2.5%, so it was 1.5 times that, or a maximum of 4% loss on what we risked, or about $200 million, well within what we could afford. Desperate to defend the pound, the Bank of England and the British government spent 27 billion pounds, about $54 billion, in a single day to support the pound, and raised interest rates from 10 to 15%, even though the country was in a recession, so the rate should have been lowered. The evening of September 16, 1992, the UK's Minister of Finance, Norman Lamont, called a press conference at 7:30 p.m., facing masses of battery of TV cameras from all over the world. He announced Britain's exit from the ERM, that the interest rate hikes were also rescinded, and that the pound from there on would float determined by the market. This made a decisive victory for currency speculators like Soros. At the center of Soros' theory of reflexivity stands his statement that markets can influence the events they anticipate. This case stands as a testament to Soros' insight and how he made use of it to make money, a whole boatload of money. Now, I want to conclude not just with this case study, because it gives a misleading impression of the totality of the man, but say a word about Soros' philanthropy. He has been one of the most generous philanthropists of our times. In his lifetime so far, Soros had put cumulative $32 billion of his wealth into philanthropic enterprises, primarily his charitable foundation, with his Open Society foundations as his flagship. Soros' lifetime philanthropy puts him only slightly behind Bill Gates, 36 billion, and Warren Buffett, 35 billion in terms of dollars given. His philanthropy and political activism have placed Soros at the center of America's, in fact, the globe's culture wars, primarily for using his enormous wealth to support causes he believes to be right. As a result, he has been lambasted by autocratic regimes as well as by populists, and particularly by those on the right of the political spectrum. Soros wrote, "I occupied an exceptional position. My success in the financial markets has given me a greater degree of independence than most other people. This allows me to take a stand on controversial issues. In fact, it obliges me to do so." In conclusion, I hope to have demonstrated that George is not only brilliant in his profession, but is also a generous man. I'm grateful for the profound insights, the vision, the expertise he had communicated to my colleagues and students. It has been a pleasure to share some of those insights with you today. Thank you.
Néha én is bejövök úgy, hogy
Persze, mert nem raktad magad köré, mondanom sem kell.
Na és akkor közben
schedule